As our episode begins, a young woman working her garden becomes frightened, nearly out of her wits, by what appears to be a simple child's drawing, dancing stick figures made in white chalk on the edges of her lawn. Her husband looks on in utter confusion as she runs hysterically, seeking refuge inside their stately manor house. And so begins the adventure of the dancing men. In his 1999 book, A Study in Celluloid, producer Michael Cox recalls his feelings on this dark mystery. Although it is a particular favorite of mine, I doubt if there is a sadder story in the whole canon than this account of unexpected happiness destroyed by a message from the past. Hilton Cubitt and his young wife have harmed nobody, yet one of them meets a violent death and the other is left alone and guilty in a foreign country. It is a bleak enough tale, yet it was high on Conan Doyle's list of his own favorites. I think we brought one or two flourishes of our own to it, and I certainly remember the filming of it with great affection. Bleak as the outcomes of this story may eventually be, back at Baker Street, Holmes and Watson enter our tale on a decidedly lighter note.
So, Watson, you do not propose to invest in South African securities?
How on earth do you know that?
Now confess, you are utterly taken aback.
I am.
I should make you sign a paper to that effect.
Why?
Because in a few minutes you'll say it is all so absurdly simple.
I should say nothing of the kind.
You see, my dear Watson, it is not really difficult to construct a series of inferences, each dependent upon its predecessor and each simple in itself. If after doing so one simply knocks out the central inferences and presents one's audience with the starting point and the conclusion, one may produce a startling, though possibly a meretricious effect. I can tell by an inspection of the groove between your left forefinger and thumb that you've decided not to invest your small capital in the gold fields.
I can see no connection.
Very likely not. But I can quickly give you a close connection. Here are the missing links in the very simple chain. You had chalk between your forefinger and thumb when you returned from the club last night. You put chalk there when you play billiards to ease the cue. You never play billiards except with Thurston. Now, Thurston, you told me 4 weeks ago, had an option on some South African security which expired in a month and which he desired you to share with him. Your checkbook is locked in my drawer, and you have not asked for the key, so you do not propose to invest your money in that manner.
How absurdly simple.
Quite so. Every problem is absurdly simple when it is explained to you. Bum, 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 bum.
Now, fans of Conan Doyle will immediately recognize something very special here. Holmes' entire dialogue is taken almost word for word directly from the original story, but the shooting script was originally quite different, and it was Jeremy Brett who insisted on staying true to the original. In David Stuart Davies' book, Bending the Willow, Jeremy Brett recounts how his input was responsible for changing the script. I managed to do the whole of it. It was the first 2 pages of the story, and I said, I think I can do it straight from the book. And they said, don't be silly. You cannot lift literature off the page and put it straight onto film. And I said, can I try? I didn't have lunch that day. I went to the back cloth and walked up and down, learning it. John Bruce, the director, said, Jeremy wants another go. And I did it. It was very nerve-wracking, very fast. And I think that was the turning point when I suddenly realized I was getting nearer Doyle's Holmes. From his comfortable chair, Watson questions his friend's contagious good mood.
Holmes, why are you so cheerful? You're unemployed, you have no case to solve. Now, normally that produces black moods and the infernal lethargy of the cocaine bottle.
You have not used the logical principles which I constantly expound.
Sherlock Holmes is cheerful, so Sherlock Holmes must have a case.
Pah! See what you can make of that, friend Watson.
Holmes hands his colleague a scrap of paper upon which a series of stick figures appear in a line. Watson dismisses it as a child's drawing, but Holmes is not so quick to judge. He tells Watson that they are expecting company. A Mr. Hilton Cubitt of Derbyshire is responsible for the pictogram, and he'll be arriving on the next train. Presently, Mr. Cubitt arrives, eager to know what Mr. Holmes thinks of his mystery. When Holmes attempts to dismiss it as a prank, Hilton explains that the drawings have frightened his wife nearly to death.
She says nothing, tries to appear normal, but I've never seen anyone so upset.
In white chalk on a garden seat. It is a precise copy.
It's as exact as I could make it. I did think it might be the stable boy, but the lad denied it. If there's any danger threatening my wife, Mr. Holmes, I'd spend my last penny to protect her.
Do sit down, Mr. Cubitt.
In tonight's program, Mr. Hilton Cubitt is played by Kenyan-born actor Tennille Evans. Born in 1926, he was very much the epitome of a solid, working character actor. An impressive 164 credits on IMDb starting in 1960 and ending in 2004. These were nearly all guest roles or appearances on shows that did not last very long, with one exception being a 13-episode stint on the show My Brother's Keeper, in which he played Sergeant Blewett. Evans is also remembered for playing Major Daly in the 4-episode Carnival of Monsters arc in the 10th season of Doctor Who in 1973. He and Jeremy Brett actually appeared together a number of times over the years. In 1960, he played Jonathan Cale in Tess, the ITV adaptation of Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which also featured Jeremy Brett. His final role was an episode of the comedy romance series William and Mary, which also starred Martin Clunes, who, as it happens, is the nephew of Jeremy Brett. In 1985, he stepped away from acting to become an ordained priest in the Church of England. He died in 2009 at the age of 83. Back to Baker Street. Hilton Cubitt explains that after a brief whirlwind romance, he proposed to an American girl, Elsie, and happily to him, she accepted. But Holmes finds himself becoming impatient with this prattling backstory.
And when did the first cloud cover the sun of this great happiness?
You have a way of putting things, Mr. Holmes.
And you have a way of prevaricating with your answers, Mr. Cubitt.
Hilton explains that some months ago, a peculiar change came over his wife. It all began one day when she received a letter from Chicago, America. At first, she appeared excited to receive it, but as soon as Hilton's back was turned, she frantically burned the letter, unopened. After the passing of some time, things seemed to return to normal in Derbyshire. Then the drawings of the dancing men began to appear, returning Elsie to her nervous state worse than before. Wary of approaching the police, Mr. Cubitt has come to Sherlock Holmes for help.
Then I will help you with all my heart. Have you seen or heard of any strangers in the neighborhood?
No, I haven't. Some of the farmers take in lodgers, but I've not heard of any lately.
Then I suggest that you return to Derbyshire, Mr. Cubitt, and keep a sharp lookout, and make an exact copy of any fresh dancing men that may appear.
Dr. Watson escorts Hilton Cubitt away, assuring him not to worry. On his chalkboard, Holmes begins to decipher the cryptogram of the dancing men, while Watson ponders the mystery.
It's perfectly natural she should receive a letter from America. She's from America.
Yes, but it is not natural to throw it onto the fire unopened.
It's beginning to look like semaphore.
You have read my monograph on secret ciphers.
Some of it. I found it rather heavy going.
It evidently has a meaning. If it is purely arbitrary, it may be impossible to solve. However, if it is systematic, we should be able to get to the bottom of it. But we need more messages, and preferably long ones.
Now, Jeremy Brett was a southpaw, a lefty, but he was convinced that Holmes was right-handed and insisted on using that hand at the chalkboard. In fact, throughout the series, anytime he must write a note or pack a pipe, Jeremy Brett stayed true to character and always used his right, something fun to keep an eye on as the seasons progress. So, as Hilton Cubitt returns to his estate in Derbyshire, he finds a new message has appeared on the front door. Dismayed, he hastens to rub it out, but not before taking an exact copy, which he mails to Holmes post-haste. Later that evening, Elsie returns, stricken and nervous. Hilton tries not to press his wife, but the strain between them is becoming unbearable.
Hilton, come to bed. Everything will look better in the morning.
Will the drawings look better? Will the dancing men look better?
Why do they fuss you so?
Fuss me!
They're just a joke, a bit of mischief. The moon's high. Where I come from, they say a moon like that drives you crazy.
The second American lady to appear in the Granada series in as many episodes, Elsie Cubitt is played by American actress Betsy Brantley. Born in 1955, she studied English at the University of North Carolina and acting at the Central School of Speech and Drama in the UK, where she eventually ended up at the National Theatre. Betsy has a wide range of screen credits to her name, first being 5 Days of Summer with Sean Connery, but perhaps her most notable role is that of Fred Savage's mother in the film version of The Princess Bride. Betsy also provided her talents as a performance model for the character of Jessica Rabbit in the 1988 Robert Zemeckis film Who Framed Roger Rabbit. She was also famously married to the director Steven Soderbergh from 1989 to 1994. In the book, The Television Sherlock Holmes, Peter Haining reports, Betsy found an immediate affinity with her part, as, like Elsie, she is, quote, an American who traveled about and decided to settle in England, end quote. During filming, she also recalled that Sherlock Holmes was always my holiday reading as a child. Let's return to our story. As Hilton and Elsie embrace in the moonlight, a dark figure appears at the window, and Hilton, retrieving a revolver, chases him across the lawn, not noticing that a new chalk message has been scrawled on the door behind him. The next day, Cubitt, Holmes, and Watson compare the messages to date. With no solution in mind, Hilton resolves himself to take matters to the next level.
Well, I know what I'm going to do. I shall go home. I shall put half a dozen of my lads in the shrubberies. If this fella calls again, give him such a thrashing, he'll leave us alone in the future.
Well, that would be one way.
Mr. Cubitt, this case is too deep for such a simple remedy. Good day, Mr. Cubitt. We will join you in a couple of days, and be patient.
Goodbye, Dr. Watson. I'll find my own way.
Bye. Weren't exactly sympathetic.
He doesn't come to me for sympathy. It is a considerable challenge. I shall work better for silence.
Having found a starting point, Holmes begins to fill in the puzzle. Meanwhile, back at Derbyshire, another message has appeared. Hilton becomes angry, but Elsie is nowhere to be found. Deep in the garden, Elsie hides a secret note under the garden bench. Back at Baker Street, Watson eats, but Holmes cannot. He is uneasy. Having deciphered one of the notes, the chalkboard now reads, "Am here, Abe Slaney." Holmes grinds his teeth and shuts his eyes, impatiently awaiting a response to a telegram he has sent to America. As Holmes' agitation grows, he struggles to resist the call of the cocaine bottle. Meanwhile, Hilton Cubitt lies sleeping in his bed, dreaming of dancing men. But in the night, he is awakened by voices raised somewhere inside the house. As he lights a candle and readies his revolver, he follows the distant sounds. When a man's voice angrily fills the hall, Elsie screams, and Hilton rushes to her aid. As Mr. Cubitt vanishes into the darkness of the house, the sound of a gunshot rings out. The next morning, Holmes receives a final note from Hilton Cubitt. Transcribing it to the chalkboard, they are horrified to decipher its message. Elsie, prepare to meet thy God. Before they can even finish writing, they're off to warn their client. Outside, a courier intercepts Holmes with a telegram from the United States.
Mr. Holmes, sir.
Thank you. It's from Wilson Hargreave of the Chicago Police Bureau. In reply to your inquiry, Abe Slaney is one of the most dangerous men in Chicago.
Some pancreas. Come along, Rick. Come along.
Emboldened, they race to the train station. But arriving at High Peak Junction on the Midland Railway and hurrying to the Cubitt estate, they are mistaken for surgeons.
Riddle in thought matter, gentlemen.
As fast as you can.
How do you know?
Expect you're the surgeon from London, sir.
I beg your pardon. What makes you...
She's not dead yet, sir. You may be able to save her. But she's for the gallows.
The gallows?
Why, that's her. She murdered her husband.
Shocked, they board the cab. Holmes fumes with self-contempt at his apparent failure.
Inspector of Police and Doctor of Medicine, I perceive.
Yes, indeed. Inspector Martin, Derbyshire Constabulary.
And I'm Dr. Carthew, the surgeons. This way, gentlemen.
This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. And I am his friend and colleague, Dr. Watson.
Mr. Holmes? But what do you know of this business?
A good deal. Mr. Hilton Cubitt was my client.
But the crime was only committed at 3 o'clock this morning. How could you hear of it in London and get to the spot as soon as I?
I anticipated it.
We came in hope of preventing it.
Then you must have important evidence of which I am ignorant.
Only the evidence of the dancing men.
The dancing men?
Now, I will explain all that to you later. Since we are too late to prevent this tragedy, I am anxious to ensure that justice is done. Will you associate me in your investigation, or will you prefer that I should act independently?
I should be proud for us to work together, Mr. Holmes. But I must warn you, there seems very little to investigate. Mr. Hilton Cubitt has been shot through the heart and he's dead.
And Mrs. Cubitt?
Seriously wounded.
Jeremy Brett was quite fond of David Burke's performance in this episode. In Bending the Willow, he remarked, "I loved the way David stood up for me when the local police didn't know who I was. He stepped forward and announced, 'This is Sherlock Holmes.' In some ways, Watson is stronger than Holmes. That comes through his kindness, I suppose. He sees Holmes' weaknesses and tries to protect him from them. Look how Watson rants at him about cocaine. Watson is always on the lookout in order to save his friend from pain, indignity, or destruction." I couldn't agree more with Mr. Brett's sentiments here. The way Watson reinforces and protects Holmes in this episode is a wonderful, subtle angle of their relationship that was just rarely captured on film prior to the Granada series. As our story continues, Holmes and Watson learn that Elsie Cubitt's wound was self-inflicted. 1 gun, 2 bullets. Believing that Elsie murdered her husband and then turned to suicide, the police think the case is closed. Holmes feels differently and asks to see the servants. Each gives their account of the events. A loud bang was heard, followed by a second, quieter one. They found the bedroom door open and went downstairs, where they smelled something awful.
Ah, you mean of the gunpowder?
Suppose it was, sir, yes.
Now, you say the smell was worse downstairs. Could you also smell gunpowder upstairs?
Yes, sir.
I commend that fact very carefully to your attention, Inspector. Mrs. King. Would you like to sit down, Mrs. King? Now, was the library door open when you reached it?
Open, yes, sir. We could see the candle alight on the table, and so we came in. And then... Oh, terrible a thing as ever I saw or ever feared to see. She was terrible wounded, sir. She was moaning and groaning. Then she sort of collapsed on the floor and she hasn't said anything since.
Saunders.
We moved her up to her bedroom, sir, and sent Fred Walker for the doctor and the police.
And there was no sign of a break-in? Or of an intruder?
No, sir. And all the doors and windows was locked, as we had left them when we went to bed.
Having heard enough, Holmes moves to the scene of the crime, where they examine the body. Mr. Cubitt lies dead, the bullet still lodged in his heart. The second bullet, also still inside Mrs. Cubitt, seems to confirm the inspector's findings. But inside Elsie's handbag, Holmes finds a roll of 50-pound notes. A bribe, he claims, that failed. Watson examines the gun.
So, 2 bullets fired, 2 wounds inflicted, as you said.
Yes, Doctor.
Then how do you account for the bullet that has so obviously struck the window frame?
By George, however did you see that?
Because, Dr. Carthew, I looked for it.
Wonderful. Why, the bullet's still there.
So a third shot must have been fired.
Which means that a third person must have been present.
Exactly.
As our series progresses, we will come to meet many police inspectors, but tonight's episode introduces us to Inspector Martin of the Derbyshire Constabulary, played by veteran English actor David Ross. Ross is perhaps best known for playing Crichton in the first Red Dwarf series back in 1988, and returning to the series in 1991 and 2017 as the voice of Talkie Toaster. Here, he plays a country detective who is more than happy to see the great consulting detective in action. And while he serves little purpose to the mystery here, he watches with full smiles as Holmes unravels the clues. Back at the scene of the crime, Holmes deduces that Cubitt must have been aiming at someone at the window and turns his attentions there. Cat-like, Holmes exits through the sill and dances tiptoe in the rocks outside. Gingerly, he lifts up a clue, the cartridge casing from the bullet that killed Hilton Cubitt. Holmes has nearly put all the pieces together. Back inside, Watson is confused by the evidence.
Holmes, if 3 shots were fired, why did Mrs. King and Saunders only hear 2 shots?
They were telling the truth, but lied without realizing it.
I'm not sure that I follow you.
You remember what Mrs. King said? I was awoken by this terrible bang. An explosion. It is the only word. And then, a minute later, there was another bang, but not so loud. The first bang was 2 shots, fired almost simultaneously. One from the window, which killed Hilton Cubitt, and one from Hilton Cubitt, which missed and went into the window frame.
And the third shot?
The saddest of all, Mrs. Cubitt self-administered in her despair.
Holmes then asks the servants if they know the name Eldridge's. Walker says there is a lonely farm by that name some miles away. Holmes wastes no time in composing a note addressed to a Mr. Abe Slaney. He sends it off with Walker, insisting that no mention of Holmes or the crime be made. Sherlock Holmes drinks his tea and makes it clear that they will be expecting a visitor very soon. Upstairs, the doctors operate on a dying Mrs. Cubitt. Meanwhile, Watson explains to the police the finer points of deciphering the code. Holmes smiles as his friend recites from his monograph on ciphers and codes.
But how did you break the code?
Well, you see, the rules which guide us in deciphering all secret writing depend on the fact that E is the most common letter in the English language. So you see, we were very fortunate that Mrs. Cubitt's name was Elsie, and that it featured in the second message, which gave us not only the E, but the L, the S, and the I. Now, next, it seemed likely to us that 2 of the messages were appeals of some sort to Mrs. Cubitt.
I think this is a fine time to introduce the actor behind the unflappable Dr. John Watson, Mr. David Burke. Born on the 25th of May, 1934, in Liverpool, David Burke attended Oxford University, where he was bitten by the acting bug. He later attended the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London and distinguished himself on stage, spending a number of years with the National Theatre Company, though never appearing on the same stage with Jeremy Brett, who was also a member. Burke then moved on to the Royal Lyceum Company in Scotland, where he dazzled audiences in major roles in plays including Macbeth, Othello, and War and Peace. When he was offered the role of Watson, he was reluctant to accept, fearing that the role was so average that it bordered on boring. But when his wife and friends assured him that this was the very reason why he was so perfect for the role, he accepted with good humor. In the afterword of Peter Haining's 1986 book, Burke wrote, "If Dr. Watson is very like me, it is also true that lots of people are very like Dr. Watson, which has much to do with his success. It is difficult to identify with Sherlock Holmes unless you are brilliant, neurotic, and highly successful. It is easy to find common ground with Watson. I believe he had more in common with his creator than Holmes had, and I have a true story to support this contention. A couple of years ago, I became acquainted with an old man who had, in his youth, been Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's gardener. He told me that one day the house was burgled. Nothing serious, but something had quite clearly been stolen. Before anyone could shout, 'Stop thief!' Sir Arthur was on his hands and knees with his magnifying glass, checking doors and windows and poking about in the flower beds. 2 hours later, he was still hard at it, and when the local constable walked up the drive and announced that he had arrested the thief, a well-known local mischief maker, Sir Arthur had been trying very hard to be Sherlock Holmes, but ended up looking much more like Dr. Watson." Fans of the series will know that David Burke left the program after only 13 episodes. Burke and his wife Anna had received a joint invitation to join the Royal Shakespeare Company, and they considered it to be the best situation for their 3-year-old son, Tom. So, in 1985, David Burke put away his pipe and pen and left Baker Street forever. In Keith Frankel's book, Granada's Greatest Detective, Burke looked back on his early experiences with the show. When the first episode of Holmes went out in 1984, it was obvious we'd pulled in a big audience. I remember walking around London the morning after it had gone out thinking, so this is what it's like to be famous. Okay, Dr. Watson, get ready for the autographs. Sure enough, this bloke looked at me and came over. "All right, mate," he said. "Are you still working for the gas board?" That was as famous as I got. But fans of the show might be surprised to learn that the Granada series was not his first experience with Sherlock Holmes. In the 1965 BBC adaptation of The Adventure of the Beryl Coronet starring Douglas Wilmer and Nigel Stock, Burke played the villain. He continues to work to this day. In fact, he played the role of the village constable in the 2012 film version of The Woman in Black. At the time of this recording, David Burke is 84 years old. As we return to our program, we find ourselves back in Derbyshire, where a mysterious caller arrives at the house in answer to Holmes' letter. Holmes readies his revolver as the doorbell rings. Abe Slaney enters the house, inquiring for Mrs. Elsie Cubitt. As he enters the library, Holmes emerges from his hiding place and presses a gun at Slaney's temple. The police pounce and have him in handcuffs at once.
Well, gentlemen, it looks like you've got the drop on me, but what the hell is going on?
Abe Slaney, I believe.
What if I am, and who are you anyway?
My name would mean nothing to you, though I suspect that of Wilson Hargreave of the Chicago Police Department will. I see that it does. Mr. Slaney, you should know that Mrs. Elsie Cubitt is very seriously ill.
I don't believe you. This is some cheap trick. Mrs. Elsie Cubitt wrote me a note just an hour ago. A note that only I can understand.
What one man can invent, another can discover. I'm here. Abe Slaney. At Eldridge's, come, Elsie. And your last note to her, Elsie. Prepare to meet thy God. And this?
You wrote that note? But you were lying about Elsie.
Slaney, when you shot and killed Hilton Cubitt, Elsa Cubitt, in her despair, attempted to kill herself and is now at death's door.
No.
No! I gotta see her! I gotta see her! I love her, for God's sake! Elsie! I love you, Elsie! Elsie! Elsie!
I believe that she fled from America to avoid you. Because you followed her and made her life a misery, she now lies under grave suspicion of murdering the husband she loved. The least you can do is to clear her of that.
Slaney breaks down sobbing and tells all. Elsie's father, a powerful Chicago criminal, promised her to Slaney. It was her father who invented the dancing men, a code for mobsters and villains. But Elsie detested the whole criminal enterprise and ran away to England. When Slaney received no reply to his letters, he sought her out. And when she finally agreed to meet, she attempted to bribe him to leave her in peace, but he became enraged. In that moment, Hilton Cubitt appeared, and shots were fired. Cubitt was killed instantly. Slaney fled, and Elsie, closing the window, turned to see that her beloved was gone. In her grief, she raised his weapon to her head and fired. The character of Abe Slaney is portrayed here by Eugene Lipinski. A solid working British actor, often cast as a Russian, he managed a pretty decent American accent in The Dancing Men. His IMDb credits are plenty, with recurring roles in many recent shows, such as Fringe, Arrow, and the Romeo section for CBC, and while his screen time in this episode is limited to the final act, he delivers a solid, emotional performance as the grieved American gangster. The police thank Holmes and take Slaney away, but Watson still has questions.
Holmes? What did you write in that note?
See if you can read it.
Come here at once. Come here at once.
How absurdly simple.
And so the dancing men, which had so often been the agents of evil, were finally used on the side of justice. Abe Slaney was condemned to death at the Derby Assizes, but his sentence was changed to penal servitude in consideration of mitigating circumstances, in the certainty that Hilton Cubitt had fired the first shot. Mrs. Cubitt made a complete recovery and lives still at Ridlingthorpe Manor.
Original episode air date, May 1st, 1984, at 9 p.m. on the ITV network. Though the second episode to air, this was actually the fifth episode filmed. Adapted by Anthony Skeen and directed by John Bruce. So this would be the only script Anthony Skeen would contribute to the Granada series, though he did also pen an episode of The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes in 1971. He is probably best remembered for his work on The Prisoner, however, where he wrote 3 of that series' 17 episodes. Michael Cox once wrote of Anthony Skeen, "One of Anthony Skeen's happiest contributions to the script was to bring forward into the Baker Street section Holmes's mention of his monograph on secret writings. He casually suggests that Watson is familiar with it, which of course he is not, but Watson is intrigued, and from that point on makes every effort to read the little book, while concealing his ignorance from Holmes." Anthony Skeen retained Conan Doyle's denouement, but compressed it because we did not feel it necessary to explain the principles of code-breaking in full. He allows Watson to show his newfound skill to the police inspector, while Holmes looks on with patient amusement. He also gives Holmes the chance to throw back at his friend the phrase, "How absurdly simple." Anthony Skeen was born in Brentford in 1924. He died in 2000 at the age of 76. Now, director John Bruce would go on to helm 3 other episodes of the program: The Speckled Band, The Red-Headed League, and The Second Stain. He also famously directed 2 episodes of Poirot, 2 episodes of Tales of the Unexpected, and a massive 35 episodes of The Bill between 1989 and 2001. He got his start as a production assistant on Doctor Who in 1968, and even did a stint as a PA on a short-lived series in 1967 called Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which attempted to televise Doyle's non-Sherlock stories, including tales about boxing, medical matters, and other supernatural phenomena. Sadly, almost all of those episodes are now believed to be lost. In Bending the Willow, producer Michael Cox said of this episode, "By the time we did that one, Jeremy and David had established a very good rapport, and they contributed quite a lot of fun about the solving of the code. I know they contributed that bit of business at the end where Watson is explaining to the others how you break a code, saying E is the most frequently used letter in the alphabet. I suspect also that they contributed the moment where Watson is secretly reading Holmes's monograph on ciphers, a trifling monograph upon the subject of secret writings, in which he analyzed 160 separate ciphers. Whatever, that was the kind of thing they enjoyed." Okay, well, Luke, here we are, episode 2, The Dancing Men.
Yes.
I've seen this one many times, as I know you have, and I noticed something in just my last viewing of this that I never noticed before, and I wonder if you've ever seen it. Holmes asks Watson if he's read his monograph on codes and ciphers, and he says that he hasn't. But did you notice that Watson sneaks a read of it while Holmes is working on the chalkboard? That's the little red book he opens.
Oh, I thought that was just his notebook.
I always thought that too, but as I was reading through the books for the research of the episode, it turns out that there are a number of times when they filmed him opening the book and trying to catch up on his reading, and that's why at the end when he explains it to the constable, he's caught up.
Yeah.
But I thought that was cool. I never caught it before.
Yeah. I didn't know that either.
Yeah. I don't know. I think this episode has a lot of kind of classic Jeremy Brett moments in it. The one that comes to mind immediately is when he's out on the rocks looking for the shell casing.
Yeah.
I remember it was our dad actually who turned me on to this show originally, and those were the moments he liked the best, when Holmes was acting like
straddling the wall.
Yeah, exactly. Acting like a cat.
Mine was after he explains why Watson wasn't going to invest. And he says, every problem is absurdly simple when it's explained to you. Bum, 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 bum.
Right. Yeah. I think in both of the annotated books, in the Leslie Klinger and the Baring Gould, there's a note in there about how Watson apparently has some kind of gambling problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why his checkbook is locked in Holmes' drawer. It depends on which annotated book you read. One of them says that, but the other one mentions the fact that maybe it was because it was an international deal, and Watson was a nationalist, so he wasn't going to have anything to do with that.
Yeah, that was in the Baring Gould.
Yeah.
That's why he didn't invest, or maybe why he didn't invest, because it said it would have been a good investment based on something at the time.
Yeah, and these annotated books are funny because, I mean, the minutia that they dig up for these books. I remember in one of them, I think it's the Klinger book, someone points out that if Watson is a medical man, there's no way he would have come back home with chalk still in his hands. He would have washed his hands.
he would have washed them.
Yeah. I think it's nitpicking a little more than I'm comfortable with, but speaking of nitpicking, I want to share something with you. This is from the Keith Frankel book, Granada's Greatest Detective. And this book is really interesting because it kind of mines quotes from a lot of different sources, but the author also takes a moment, usually for each episode, to give his thoughts. And I found this really interesting. He starts off by saying, still so embryonic, the series at this point, understandably, this episode stays dogmatically true to its mission statement and makes as tidy a transition from literature to live action as it's possible to envisage. Between them, dramatist Anthony Skeen and director John Bruce produce something fastidiously literal and unabashedly respectful, but arguably reverentially dispassionate too. And then he goes on to say, such intimacy with the source material gives rise to Granada overlooking a single central truth, that the reason these tales have survived for so long is that they are indestructible and can afford to be manhandled. I kind of just disagree with him here. Like, I always prefer when someone stays true to the source material. I think that's what makes this series last, is the fact that they didn't try to...
Fight Nazis?
Sure. Right, exactly, like they did in the Basil Rathbone movies.
Yeah.
But, I guess I just have to totally disagree with that. I mean, and I think Jeremy Brett would be in our corner on this one, because that was why he carried around that copy of the book with him all the time, because he wanted to make sure they stayed true.
Yeah. I do think they are fairly bulletproof. I mean, the new Sherlock series obviously takes liberties, but they're good.
Yeah.
But I definitely prefer, obviously, Jeremy Brett.
Well, a tangent here. Speaking of the Benedict Cumberbatch series, I don't know if you noticed, in the final sequence of the last episode that aired, did you happen to notice the dancing men on the chalkboard?
I think so. I haven't watched it in a long time, though.
When it aired, I took a screen capture of it and deciphered it, and it says, "Am here, Abe Slaney." So they're just giving a little nod, I guess.
Yeah.
So there's one really interesting thing about this episode that Michael Cox also mentions in one of the books, but the mitigating circumstances that they close the episode out with, in the, quote, certainty that Hilton Cubitt had fired first, end quote. What do you think about that? How did they figure out that there's a certainty that he fired first?
I don't know. I mean, in the episode, you actually do see it. Because you hear the bang and then you see him get hit with a squib or whatever.
Okay, well, here's one little annotation from the Klinger book. He says, the nature of the, quote, mitigating circumstances, quote, that led to the commutation of Slaney's sentence is unclear. Harry Ober argues righteously that threatening a woman with death, coming to her house armed, probably flourishing a gun, and mortally wounding her husband, who was defending his wife properly, all constitute to me a chain of criminal acts which add up to murder in the first degree. And then the author continues to say, however, a British court may have concluded that there was little evidence that Slaney intended to kill anyone, except for the ambiguous evidence of prepare to meet thy God, and that he was merely acting in self-defense when he fired the shot that killed Cubitt. I don't know. I don't think I buy it, but apparently it was good enough for Arthur Conan Doyle.
I still don't know how it explains that he shot first.
Well,
sure, it's self-defense, but...
Yeah, but did he deserve to get off?
I just wrote some things down that make me laugh in this episode.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say them now.
Sure.
The way David Burke says, goodbye.
Yeah.
At the end. And he's like smiling and wringing his hands at the same time.
Yeah.
And also when Hilton Cubitt is fighting with Elsie Cubitt, and she says, I don't know why these little scribbles fuss you so. And he says, fuss me?
Yeah. I honestly think this is, I mean, I don't know that I put it in my top 10 episodes, but maybe so. I mean, it's just, it's again, these early ones are really pretty great. I think Jeremy Brett had, even though he was struggling to figure out the character, I think he really had the right instincts here. And, you know, when he stands up and he says, Watson, if this is E, and he puts his arms up, and he said, flag denotes the end of words, and he gives a little grin.
Yeah. Just more of the physicality of Jeremy Brett.
Yeah, which he was able to do much easier when he was younger and healthier.
Sure, but he still did it. I mean, he still, like, flopped himself on the ground in later episodes, but
yeah,
it is some of the great stuff.
Yeah.
Another great Jeremy Brett thing that I assume he came up with, because I don't know how anyone would direct you in this way, but the way he cocks the gun and puts it against his head, he, like, puts both hands on the gun and slides it into his head and then cocks it.
Yeah. I have to say, I thought about this on the last viewing, too. I was like, how often does Jeremy Brett even use a gun in the series? Most of the time it's Watson, bring the revolver.
Yeah.
But this is one where he doesn't even mention it to Watson. He just carries his own gun and puts it up to the guy's head. Interesting.
Yeah.
You have to see how many more times Holmes is packing iron.
Does he ever fire it in the Granada series? I don't think he does.
I honestly, it's a good question, and I guess we'll have to find out. I don't remember the answer.
We'll find out later.
Yeah. Well, there's not a ton of interesting trivia, really, in either annotated book. I mean, there's a lot of blank pages, to be honest.
I have a piece of trivia.
Oh, yeah?
The actor who played Abe Slaney, Eugene Lipinski.
Yeah.
He was born in England, but he was raised in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And for people, well, I mean, that's the trivia. But for people who live in England and hear his voice as an American, that's not an American accent.
Yeah, it's interesting because I said something about that, and it was, he manages a halfway decent accent.
Yeah, but he sounds like Mike Myers to me.
Yeah, it's the difference between American and Canadian is slight, but to Americans it's obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Earlier, before I knew anything about this series, that one of the first times I saw it, I remember thinking to myself, Elsie Cubitt is a really great British actress who's doing a halfway decent American accent.
But she's American too.
She's actually American too.
Yeah.
But she had been living in England for a long time, so I feel like it kind of goes into her voice.
I think the thing is, for British people, American TV during that time, the drama maybe wasn't on the same level.
Yeah.
So watching these shows was more entertaining and more believable.
Yeah.
Have you ever written anything in Dancing Men? Because it takes a while.
Yeah.
Not only to remember and look up each letter, but you're basically drawing a picture for every letter of a sentence you're trying to write.
I feel like I must have done this.
So that's why it's like, am here.
Yeah. Right.
Did they ever say why everyone had so much disdain for Walker?
I don't know, but I have to say, I think Walker is one of my favorite things about this episode nowadays.
Yeah.
When I see it, he's just kind of this refreshingly obnoxious servant with attitude that just permeates from his pores.
Yeah.
he's just a weird character that they threw in there.
Yeah, so that was a weird choice.
Yeah.
So this story appeared in the Strand magazine in England in December 1903. It first appeared in the U.S. in Collier's Weekly on December 5th, 1903. But the tale itself takes place Wednesday, July 27th, 1898 through Saturday, August 13th, 1898, according to the Baring Gould.
Also, according to the Baring Gould, I thought this was an interesting note. Conan Doyle placed The Adventures of the Dancing Men high on his 12 best list. He rated it as number 3, and that's interesting, but even more so, the original manuscript was donated by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to the Red Cross charity sale in 1918 and was auctioned, bringing in £10, 10 shillings. It was auctioned again in New York City in 1923, and then it brought in $105, and again in London in 1925, where it sold with a lot with the Priory School and the Solitary Cyclist, all original manuscripts, for £66. But the most interesting thing about that is that its present location, the original manuscript, is unknown. Apparently it's lost or no one knows who has it.
This episode also has forever made me want to have an antique brass microscope.
Yeah, the one Holmes has is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, another interesting thing about this episode is that this is one of only 2 Sherlock Holmes short stories where his client dies after seeking his help. Can you name the other one? The 5 Orange Pips, which wasn't made into a show.
So it's not canon to this podcast.
Right. Well, also, though, if you want to see something cool, you should Google you mentioned it earlier, the Collier's Weekly Sherlock. For listeners out there who aren't familiar with it, you'll pretty quickly find the Frederick Steele covers that he drew for Holmes for The Return in 1903, which this episode, even though it's in the first series of the Granada show, is actually from The Return of Sherlock Holmes, which was actually 13 years after Scandal in Bohemia. But you know, Sidney Paget's illustrations are the famous ones that appear at the end of every episode, but Frederick Steele's illustrations were actually the ones everybody in America knew at the time, and they were actually kind of famous for inspiring the American actor William Gillette, who became one of the first actors to depict Holmes on the screen, and he's the one who made the calabash pipe and the deerstalker hat as famous as they later became. So those illustrations for Collier's were influential, at least.
Speaking of the Deerstalker, this is the first time we see the Deerstalker in the show.
Right.
I don't remember if it's the first mention of the Deerstalker or if it even is mentioned.
I don't know if they ever mention it. Again, they're not filmed in order, so I guess in the next few we'll see if they say anything about it, but I think it's just kind of assumed that that's his garb.
I'm trying to remember. I know I saw an interview with Jeremy Brett, and he talks about the hats a little bit. And I think he says we tried our best to read every line and find out if they said what kind of hat he was wearing. But I think the kind of rule was if he went too far into the country, he'd wear the Deerstalker.
Right. That seems to always be the case.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so general thoughts on this one. The good, the bad, the Jeremy. What are your favorite parts from this one?
Well, the Jeremy. I mean, there's so many little things, even just in this episode, that he does, like his rolling R's in Ridlingthorpe Manor.
Yeah.
All those things.
Eldridges.
Yeah. There was another one. He says, "Is it a lonely farm?"
Yeah, I always like that line too. It's a little sad.
Yeah.
So we both watched this show on Blu-rays. You have the U.S. edition. I have the Spanish edition. But I think one of the benefits of watching this show in HD, other than just how amazing it looks overall, is the ability to really see the teeny tiny facial muscle acting of Jeremy Brett. I think in the scene where he arrives too late and he's meeting with the doctor and the detective, and you just see Jeremy Brett seething as he's being told all the bad news, and he's trying to tell them, we'll get to all that, okay? But
yeah.
Now we need to get justice. If you watch him on a big screen TV in HD, it's every muscle in his face is tense, and it is acting like we just don't see that often these days. He is really delivering a performance, and it's just, you can keep watching these things and always see something different like that, especially now that they're in HD like this.
Yeah, and, this episode, again, it's kind of another simple type mystery. It's a cipher he has to figure out with dancing men written in chalk. But they've become as iconic as...
Well, they become as iconic as anything in Sherlock Holmes canon.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just part of the mythology. The mythology of Sherlock Holmes,
Yeah, the Deerstalker, the Calabash, the dancing men.
Right, and that's why they threw them in there in the last episode of the Benedict Cumberbatch show.
Right.
Anything in this episode you think is bad? Anything that stands out as bad? I honestly can't think of anything.
No.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty solid episode. Again, we said this last time, Scandal in Bohemia, not my favorite one. I think this would have been a stronger starting point out of the gate, perhaps, but they had to lay the ground rules, I guess, for all his cocaine using and everything else. So I guess I understand why the other one came first, but I think this is as solid as they come. So if we're still giving out Persian slippers, I'm going to give this one 10 out of 10 Persian slippers. I think it's basically perfect.
How many Persian slippers did I give out to?
Did we give out 5 or 10 last time? I don't remember.
I don't know. Maybe it was 50.
Let's go for 10 this time. I'm giving it 10.
Okay.
I don't think there's another episode that's any better than this one. I think it's pretty great. I'm not saying it's my favorite one. I'm just saying it's as solid as they come.
I don't want to just agree, so I'm going to say 9.9 because I think if I had to be completely honest, I'd still like Scandal Bohemia better. Just because of it's the same recipe of little Jeremy Brett things and Watson things, but the versions of those that are in Scandal Bohemia I like just a little bit better, but it is effectively a perfect episode.
I can understand what you're saying. I give it more points than Scandal because it's actually a mystery.
Yeah.
Even though it's a substitution cipher that is probably beneath Sherlock Holmes' skills for solving.
But there's a murder.
Yeah, exactly.
And a suicide attempt.
Yeah, and as everyone has said, it's one of the darkest episodes in the canon. So I think it's great.
One question I had, which I think you know the answer to, and I just don't remember. I know there was a story about a specific church warden pipe given to Jeremy Brett in this first season, and then it goes missing.
I don't know where I read that, And I do remember that, and I do know that this is one of those episodes where you can really see that pipe.
Yeah.
And it's a nice one. I just remember him saying that someone pilfered it after season 1 or 2, and the one they replaced it with wasn't quite as antique-y, wasn't quite as nice. That he didn't like it as much, but yeah.
By the way, we both have George Warden pipes.
That's true. That's true.
We don't smoke them.
Well, we've smoked them.
We have
times.
smoked them.
I actually have a clay pipe as well that I don't think it'll ever get as black and saturated with tar as Jeremy Brett's or Sherlock Holmes' pipe is in the episode. Which again, in HD, eventually you'll be able to see just how.
Yeah, but that's not this one.
Gross that pipe is. No, this one is a really nice wooden pipe, and I'll have to find that article. Maybe we could talk about it next time. But it's there's pipe aficionados out there. Actually, it's funny. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but Jeremy Brett's brother was a pipe smoker, and when he found out Jeremy Brett was cast in this series, he thought it was a disgrace because Jeremy wasn't a pipe smoker, and he was like, "Why would they cast you? You don't even know how to smoke a pipe."
Well, maybe give him some tips.
Yeah, well, he became a pro eventually.
It was convincing to me.
Yeah.
And it made me want to smoke.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have for today. If you would like to contribute your thoughts to the show, please get in touch with a letter or an audio recording. We would love to have more voices on the podcast. You can email us at contact@sherlockpodcast.com. Also, iTunes reviews are most appreciated and help get the podcast out there, so thank you for those as well. We also have a Patreon, so if you like what we're doing here and you'd like to support our efforts to bring you these shows, please find us there at www.patreon.com/SherlockPodcast. We hope to eventually include some bonus content there, product reviews, different things, if we find there is an interest, so thank you for that. Our next episode is a great one, The Naval Treaty. Hope to see you then.